The morning of November 9th, 1943, over the industrial heart of Schweinfurt, Germany. Technical Sergeant Raymond Miller watched through the waist gun window of his B-17 as a Focke-Wulf 190 rolled into an attack run from 4 o'clock high. The German fighter's wing guns lit up, and Miller had perhaps 2 seconds to register what was coming before the 20mm cannon shells arrived. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The first round punched through the fuselage 3 feet behind him, the explosive shell detonating inside the radio compartment. The second hit lower, impacting somewhere near the ball turret. The third should have killed him. It struck the aircraft's skin directly adjacent to his position, and Miller felt the impact transmitted through the aluminum like a hammer blow. But he didn't feel the shell explode, because it didn't penetrate. The round had hit something the Focke-Wulf pilot hadn't expected to be there. A 1/4-inch steel plate bolted to the inside of the fuselage in a location that wasn't on any Boeing blueprint, installed 3 weeks earlier by a crew chief who would have faced disciplinary action if anyone in the chain of command had bothered to inspect where he was putting surplus armor plate. Miller's bomber, designated Devil's Bargain, made it home to RAF Bassingbourn that afternoon, with 47 holes in the fuselage, 2 engines running rough, and a crew that should have included at least 1 fatality. Instead, all 10 men walked away. When the ground crew examined the damage, they found a 20mm shell lodged in the unauthorized armor plate, its fuse crushed by impact but unexploded, the steel having absorbed just enough energy to prevent detonation. The crew chief, Master Sergeant Frank Kowalski, stood looking at that embedded round and realized he'd stumbled onto something that could change the survivability equation for every B-17 flying over Germany. He also realized that what he'd done was completely outside regulations, technically constituted unauthorized modification of military aircraft, and could get him court-martialed if the wrong officer decided to make an issue of it. But those 10 men were alive because he'd broken the rules, and Kowalski knew there were hundreds more bombers flying missions without protection that could be installed with materials already sitting in salvage yards across every airbase in England. This is the story of how one crew chief's unauthorized armor installations transformed B-17 survivability during the deadliest months of the air war over Germany. How a solution developed in secret, spread through informal networks, and saved hundreds of lives before the Army Air Forces officially acknowledged it existed. And how the materials for this life-saving modification had been sitting unused on airbases for months because nobody had asked the right question about what to do with damaged armor plate that couldn't be returned to service in its original configuration. The strategic bombing campaign over Germany in late 1943 had evolved into something far deadlier than pre-war air power theorists had anticipated. The Luftwaffe had refined their tactics, and German fighter pilots had identified the most vulnerable points on American heavy bombers. They'd learned that frontal attacks, while dangerous, offered the best chance of knocking out a B-17 before its gunners could bring effective fire to bear. And they'd learned that 20mm cannon fire was devastatingly effective against the relatively thin aluminum skin of bomber fuselages. The Focke-Wulf 190 and Messerschmitt 109, fighters that intercepted American bomber formations, carried a mix of weapons. Machine guns provided high rates of fire for deflection shots, but the real killers were the 20mm cannons. The Mauser MG 151-20 cannon fired explosive shells at a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,800 feet per second. Each shell contained roughly 4 grams of high explosive with an impact fuse detonator. When these rounds struck an aircraft, they didn't simply punch holes. They exploded, transforming a single projectile into dozens of fragments that shredded hydraulic lines, severed control cables, ignited fuel vapors, and killed crew members. The effect was multiplicative. A single 20mm hit could cascade into catastrophic failure as systems failed in sequence. By October 1943, statistical analysis from the 8th Air Force showed that approximately 42% of bomber losses resulted from fighter attack rather than anti-aircraft fire. And within that category, cannon fire was identified as the primary cause in roughly 70% of cases. The bombers were being torn apart by explosive shells that their aluminum construction had no chance of stopping. The standard B-17F and G models featured armor protection only in specific locations. The pilot and co-pilot seats had armor plate backing. The radio operator had a small armor panel. Certain critical components like oil coolers had armored shrouds, but vast sections of the fuselage, particularly the waist gun positions and the areas surrounding crew stations, had no protection beyond the aircraft's quarter-inch aluminum skin. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This wasn't an oversight in Boeing's design. The engineers had made calculated decisions based on weight constraints and expected threat profiles. Every pound of armor meant one less pound of bombs, fuel, or ammunition. The pre-war assumption had been that bomber formations flying in tight defensive boxes would provide mutual fire support sufficient to keep fighters at bay. Heavy armor wasn't necessary if fighters couldn't get close enough to use their cannons effectively. Combat over Germany in 1943 proved those assumptions catastrophically wrong. German fighter pilots were willing to press attacks through defensive fire, accepting losses to break up bomber formations. The Luftwaffe had developed specialized bomber-destroyer units, Sturmgruppen, whose pilots flew heavily armored Focke-Wulf 190s, specifically designed to absorb defensive fire long enough to close within 200 yards and deliver killing bursts of cannon fire. Master Sergeant Frank Kowalski hadn't set out to revolutionize bomber defense. He'd been trying to solve a mundane logistics problem at RAF Bassingbourn in September 1943. Kowalski was crew chief for the 351st Bomb Group, responsible for maintaining aircraft and managing the mountain of spare parts, salvaged components, and damaged equipment that accumulated at any active bomber base. Among the items filling his salvage yard were armor plates removed from battle-damaged aircraft. When a B-17 took serious structural damage requiring major repair or scrapping, the intact armor components were supposed to be removed and sent to depot facilities for inspection and reissue. But the system didn't work as designed. Armor plates with minor damage, slight warping from heat, or edge cracks that didn't compromise their protective capability were rejected by depot inspectors as unsuitable for return to service in their original positions. These plates couldn't be reinstalled in pilot seats or radio operator positions because they didn't meet the precise specifications for those installations. So they sat in salvage yards, technically unserviceable for their designed purpose, but perfectly functional as armor plate. Kowalski had accumulated nearly 200 pounds of this orphaned armor by early September. It struck him as wasteful. Here was a steel plate capable of stopping bullets and fragments, sitting unused, while bombers flew missions with vast areas of their fuselages protected by nothing but aluminum. The regulations were clear about where armor could be installed. Modifications to aircraft structure required engineering approval, testing, and formal authorization through technical orders. Installing armor in non-standard locations would constitute unauthorized field modification. But Kowalski had been a crew chief long enough to understand the difference between regulations designed to ensure safety and regulations designed to maintain bureaucratic control. He started small, testing the concept on his own aircraft before expanding. In mid-September, he took a flat armor plate originally designed for a radio operator's position, trimmed the damaged edges with a grinding wheel, and bolted it to the interior fuselage wall directly behind the waist gun position on a B-17 designated Lucky 13. The installation took 2 hours. He used existing bolt holes where possible and drilled new ones where necessary, ensuring the plate was firmly mounted to structural members rather than just the skin. The plate weighed approximately 15 pounds. Its placement covered an area roughly 18 inches by 24 inches, protecting the space immediately adjacent to where the waist gunner stood during combat. Kowalski chose this location deliberately. Waist gunners were among the most exposed crew members, standing at open windows with minimal protection. They couldn't wear the full armor vests that pilots and bombardiers used because they needed mobility to track targets. But they stood in predictable positions, which meant fixed armor could protect their most vulnerable angles. The installation was deliberately inconspicuous. The plate was mounted on the interior, invisible from outside the aircraft. Unless someone specifically inspected that section of fuselage, they wouldn't notice it. And Kowalski made no entry in the maintenance logs. As far as official records were concerned, the armor plate didn't exist. Lucky 13 flew its next mission on September 23rd, a raid against industrial targets in Hanover. The bomber returned with moderate battle damage, including several machine gun hits near the waist positions, but no injuries to the waist gunners. Nothing proved the armor's effectiveness because the hits weren't in the protected area, but Kowalski's concept had survived its first combat test. The added weight hadn't affected aircraft performance noticeably, the installation hadn't interfered with any aircraft systems, and the crew hadn't complained about the modification. Encouraged, Kowalski expanded the program. Over the next 3 weeks, he installed similar armor plates in 5 more aircraft, varying the positions slightly based on his analysis of where previous battle damage had occurred. He placed plates protecting the radio operator's sides, covering blind spots in the standard armor package. He mounted plates near the ball turret entry hatch, an area frequently struck during beam attacks. He added protection around the waist gun windows at angles the standard armor didn't cover. Each installation used salvaged plates that would otherwise sit unused. Each was done during night maintenance shifts when fewer officers were present to ask questions, and each was documented only in Kowalski's personal notebook, never in official maintenance logs. By late October, 6 B-17 seconds in the 351st Bomb Group carried Kowalski's unauthorized armor, and the crews who flew those aircraft were starting to notice something unusual. October 28, 1943. Devil's Bargain returned from a mission to Bremen with extensive fighter damage. The crew reported aggressive attacks by Focke-Wulf 190s firing sustained cannon bursts during the bombing run. Post-flight inspection revealed multiple 20mm impacts. 2 had struck the tail section, causing structural damage but missing critical control surfaces. 1 had hit the number 3 engine nacelle, disabling the engine but not causing fire, and 1 had struck the fuselage directly adjacent to the left waist gun position. That 4th shell was the one that mattered. It had impacted within inches of where Technical Sergeant Raymond Miller had been standing while engaging attacking fighters. The shell struck the fuselage skin at a slight angle, penetrated the thin aluminum, and hit the armor plate Kowalski had installed 3 weeks earlier. The impact crushed the shell's nose fuse against the steel plate before the internal explosive could detonate properly. The round partially exploded, but the armor had contained most of the blast. The energy that should have filled the waist gun compartment with shrapnel instead dissipated against the steel. The fuselage skin bulged outward from the force, and the armor plate showed significant deformation where the shell had struck, but it had held. Miller had felt the impact, heard the blast, and assumed he'd been hit. He checked himself for wounds, found none, and stayed at his gun. Only after landing did he understand how close he'd come. Kowalski examined the damaged plate and immediately recognized what had happened. The armor hadn't stopped the shell completely. It had disrupted the detonation sequence just enough to prevent the full explosive effect. Against a solid shot round or armor-piercing projectile, the quarter-inch steel wouldn't have been sufficient. But against an explosive shell with a nose-mounted impact fuse, the steel provided enough resistance to crush the fuse mechanism before proper detonation occurred. This was the insight that changed everything. Kowalski hadn't been trying to make the B-17 impervious to cannon fire. That would require armor thickness that no bomber could carry. He'd created a system that disrupted the most lethal aspect of 20mm cannon rounds, their explosive effect. A solid penetration was survivable. Crew members could be wounded but live. Systems could be damaged but remain functional. But explosive detonations inside the fuselage were almost always catastrophic. If the armor could prevent proper detonation, even some of the time, it would save lives. Kowalski faced a decision. He could report his success through official channels, submit his modifications for engineering review, and wait for the bureaucracy to evaluate and potentially approve the concept. That process would take months, if it happened at all. Or he could continue installing armor plates in secret, protecting as many crews as possible while hoping nobody noticed he was violating regulations. The decision was made easier by one fact: Miller was alive. Official channels could wait. More crews needed protection immediately. November 1943 brought an intensification of the strategic bombing campaign. The 8th Air Force launched a series of maximum effort missions against industrial targets deep in Germany, accepting heavy losses to strike ball-bearing factories, aircraft plants, and synthetic fuel refineries. The missions to Schweinfurt on October 14th had cost 60 bombers shot down and another 17 damaged beyond repair. The bomber groups were being bled white, and the arrival of winter weather meant conditions would only worsen. Kowalski accelerated his armor installation program. He recruited 2 other crew chiefs, Technical Sergeant Michael Brennan and Staff Sergeant Joseph Cherwinski, both men he trusted to keep quiet about what they were doing. Together, they began systematically adding armor protection to every aircraft in the 351st Bomb Group's active inventory. The work was done at night, officially logged as routine maintenance. The armor plates were listed in salvage records as scrapped or cannibalized for parts, but they were actually being repurposed. By early November, 17 B-17 seconds carried hidden armor installations. The materials kept coming. Every time a bomber was damaged beyond repair, Kowalski's team stripped usable armor plate before the wreckage was hauled away. They scavenged plates from aircraft that had been scrapped months earlier, salvaged steel from other sources when armor plate wasn't available, and maintained a careful inventory in Kowalski's notebook of which aircraft had protection and where it was installed. The installations evolved through trial and error. Early plates were simply bolted flat against the fuselage walls, but Kowalski discovered that angling the plates slightly improved their effectiveness. A shell striking at an oblique angle was more likely to glance off or have its detonation disrupted than one striking perpendicular to the surface. He started mounting plates at 10 to 15 degree angles, using spacer blocks to create the offset. The modification added complexity to the installation but significantly improved protection. The weight penalty remained manageable. Each armor installation added between 12 and 25 pounds, depending on size and placement. Across multiple positions in a single aircraft, the total additional weight might reach 80 pounds. That was less than one crew member's body weight, less than 100 pounds of additional bombs, and far less than the weight of fuel burned during the first hour of flight. The aircraft could easily carry the burden. What Kowalski couldn't quantify was the psychological effect on crews. Word spread through informal channels that certain aircraft had extra protection. Pilots started requesting those specific bombers for missions. Crews felt more confident, which translated to better performance under stress. Men who believed they had a better chance of survival flew more aggressively, stayed in formation during attacks, and made it home more often. The armor's presence changed behavior in ways that enhanced its physical protection. By mid-November, the survival statistics for the 351st Bomb Group were beginning to diverge from the 8th Air Force average in ways that should have been impossible. The group's loss rate for November was 2.4%, compared to an 8th Air Force average of 4.1%. Aircraft from the 351st returned from missions with battle damage that would have downed unprotected bombers. Crew injury rates were declining even as the intensity of fighter opposition increased. Nobody in the group's leadership had connected the statistics to Kowalski's armor program because officially no such program existed. The armor plates remained invisible in maintenance logs, hidden inside fuselages where casual inspection wouldn't reveal them. But the mechanics knew, and the crews knew, and slowly the secret began to spread beyond Bassingbourn. December 1943 brought the first serious threat of exposure. A maintenance inspection team from 8th Air Force headquarters visited Bassingbourn to conduct routine technical compliance audits. These inspections were designed to verify that aircraft maintenance met established standards and that no unauthorized modifications had been made to combat aircraft. The inspection team, led by Captain Douglas Hartman, spent 3 days reviewing maintenance logs, inspecting aircraft, and interviewing crew chiefs. On the afternoon of December 7th, Hartman discovered Kowalski's armor. He'd been conducting a detailed fuselage inspection on Devil's Bargain, checking for stress cracks in the skin panels, when he noticed bolt holes that didn't appear on the structural diagrams. Following the bolts inward, he found the armor plate installation. The plate showed obvious impact damage, the deformed area where the 20mm shell had struck weeks earlier. Hartman immediately recognized what he was looking at: an unauthorized modification using salvaged materials installed without engineering approval. He found Kowalski in the maintenance hangar and asked a single question that could have ended the entire program. "How many aircraft have you modified?" Kowalski's response required a calculation about trust and consequences. He could deny everything, claim the armor had been installed by someone else or was part of an approved modification he wasn't aware of. Or he could tell the truth and accept whatever followed. He chose honesty. 17 aircraft, sir. All installations using salvaged armor plate rejected for depot return. No performance issues, no system interference, and at least 3 documented cases where the armor prevented casualties. Hartman was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked to see Kowalski's documentation. They spent the next 2 hours in the crew chief's office, reviewing the notebook that contained installation diagrams, weight calculations, and notes on combat damage to armored aircraft. Hartman examined the records with the focus of an engineer, asking technical questions about mounting methods, coverage areas, and material specifications. Finally, he closed the notebook and looked at Kowalski with an expression that was difficult to read. "Sergeant, you've violated approximately a dozen different regulations regarding aircraft modification. I should be writing you up for disciplinary action." Kowalski nodded. "Yes, sir. But you're not going to." Hartman allowed himself a slight smile. "No, I'm not. Because I've been reviewing casualty statistics from across the 8th Air Force, and your group's numbers are anomalous in ways I couldn't explain until now. You've stumbled onto something that needs to be expanded, not shut down. But we have a problem. What you're doing needs official authorization, and official authorization requires engineering validation, testing protocols, and procurement channels, all of which will take months we don't have." The conversation that followed established the framework for what would become the most unusual collaboration between field maintenance and headquarters engineering in the 8th Air Force's history. Hartman agreed to delay his inspection report, giving Kowalski time to document his methods properly. In exchange, Kowalski would prepare detailed technical specifications that could be submitted for retroactive approval. They would treat the existing installations as an unauthorized field test that had produced positive results, rather than as deliberate violations of standing orders. Hartman's motivation was simple. He'd seen too many young men die in bombers that should have been survivable. If Kowalski had found a way to improve those odds using materials already available, then regulations were less important than results, but they needed to build a case strong enough that higher-ranking officers couldn't ignore it. December 1943 through January 1944 became a period of careful documentation. Kowalski compiled every piece of evidence he could gather regarding armor effectiveness. He photographed damaged plates showing impact points. He collected testimony from crew members who'd survived hits to armored sections. He worked with the group's intelligence officer to map battle damage patterns and correlate them with armor placement. Captain Hartman, working behind the scenes at 8th Air Force headquarters, began gathering statistical data from other bomb groups. He compared loss rates, crew casualty rates, and aircraft damage assessments across multiple squadrons. He couldn't yet explain why the 351st's numbers were better, but he could demonstrate that they were significantly better in ways that demanded investigation. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The strategy was to build an undeniable case before presenting it to commanders who had the authority to either endorse the program or shut it down. They needed evidence so compelling that even officers concerned about regulations would have to acknowledge the armor's value. The breakthrough came on January 11, 1944. A mission to Oschersleben brought back multiple aircraft with severe fighter damage. One B-17 from the 351st, Memphis Belle II, took 6 20mm cannon hits during a sustained attack by Messerschmitt 109s. 3 shells struck unarmored sections, causing severe structural damage and wounding 2 crew members. 3 shells struck areas protected by Kowalski's hidden armor. All 3 failed to detonate properly. The shells penetrated the fuselage skin, impacted the angled armor plates, and either failed to explode entirely or detonated with significantly reduced effect. The crew survived. The bomber made it home, and the damaged armor plates provided physical evidence of exactly what Kowalski's modifications were accomplishing. Captain Hartman photographed the damage extensively. He documented the impact angles, measured the deformation in the armor plates, and collected the partially exploded shell fragments embedded in the steel. Then he prepared a report that he hand-carried to Brigadier General Frederick Castle, commander of the 4th Bombardment Wing, which included the 351st Bomb Group. The meeting in General Castle's office on January 15th could have resulted in Kowalski's court-martial. Instead, it resulted in immediate authorization to expand the armor program across the entire 4th Bombardment Wing. Castle reviewed Hartman's evidence, examined the photographs of damaged armor, read the statistical analysis showing improved survival rates, and made a command decision that prioritized results over regulations. His authorization memo, dated January 16, 1944, contained language carefully crafted to provide legal cover for what had been unauthorized activity. Given evidence of improved crew survivability through field-expedient armor installations using salvaged materials, and given the operational necessity of reducing combat losses, authorization is granted for expanded implementation of protective armor modifications, using available materials, pending formal engineering review and technical order issuance. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The authorization was deliberately vague about when the modifications had begun or how many aircraft were already protected. It treated the program as something being proposed rather than something that had been running in secret for 4 months. This allowed Kowalski and the other crew chiefs involved to avoid disciplinary action, while giving Castle the authority to mandate similar installations across all groups under his command. Within days, crew chiefs from other bomb groups were visiting Bassingbourn to learn Kowalski's methods. The salvaged armor plate program, as it became known informally, spread rapidly through the 4th Bombardment Wing. By early February, over 70 aircraft carried protection installations. The materials remained the same: armor plate rejected for depot service but functional for field applications. The installation methods followed Kowalski's techniques. Angled plates bolted to structural members in positions that protected crew stations without interfering with aircraft systems, and the results continued to validate the approach. Aircraft with armor protection showed dramatically better survival rates when struck by cannon fire. The engineering validation that Captain Hartman had promised began in late January 1944 at Wright Field in Ohio. The Army Air Force's Materiel Command needed to understand whether Kowalski's field modifications represented sound engineering or simply fortunate improvisation. A team of civilian engineers, led by Dr. Arthur Morrison from the National Defense Research Committee, was tasked with testing salvaged armor plate against 20mm cannon fire under controlled conditions. The testing program, conducted through February 1944, used actual combat-damaged armor plates provided by Kowalski. The engineers mounted these plates at various angles against representative aircraft fuselage sections and fired captured German 20mm rounds at them from distances matching typical fighter engagement ranges. The results surprised even Morrison's team, who'd approached the project with skepticism about field modifications developed without formal engineering analysis. At engagement distances of 200 yards, the standard range for German fighter attacks, quarter-inch armor plate installed at 15-degree angles successfully disrupted the detonation sequence of approximately 63% of the explosive rounds tested. The shells would penetrate the thin aluminum skin, strike the angled armor, and either fail to detonate entirely or produce significantly reduced explosive effects, as their fuses were damaged or destroyed by impact with the steel before proper detonation could occur. The remaining 37% of rounds that achieved full detonation still benefited from the armor's presence. The steel plate contained much of the fragmentation that would otherwise spread throughout the crew compartment. While the armor couldn't prevent all damage, it reduced the lethal radius of detonating shells from approximately 6 feet to less than 2 feet. Morrison's team documented another critical finding. The armor was most effective against the specific threat it had been designed to counter: explosive cannon shells from fighter attacks. Against armor-piercing rounds, the quarter-inch steel was insufficient. Against larger caliber weapons, like 30mm or 37mm cannons, the protection was minimal. But against the 20mm Mauser MG-151 cannon that equipped the majority of German fighters in 1944, the salvaged armor provided measurable, significant protection at weights aircraft could practically carry. The test program's final report, delivered to 8th Air Force headquarters in early March, recommended immediate, widespread adoption of the armor installations, with specific technical guidance for optimal placement and mounting methods. The report noted that Master Sergeant Kowalski's field-developed techniques aligned closely with what formal engineering analysis indicated were the most effective approaches. A mechanic with no engineering degree, working from intuition and combat damage observation, had essentially reverse-engineered an optimal solution to a complex ballistic protection problem. March 1944 brought official recognition and rapid expansion. Technical Order 0120-EG-214 was issued on March 18, providing formal authorization and standardized procedures for installing salvaged armor plate in B-17 aircraft. The technical order was unusual in that it specifically credited field modifications developed by maintenance personnel as the basis for the approved procedures. Master Sergeant Frank Kowalski was mentioned by name, a rare occurrence in military technical documentation that typically avoided identifying individual contributors. The order specified acceptable armor plate sources, all salvaged materials from damaged aircraft that had been rejected for return to original applications. It provided detailed mounting instructions, including the 15-degree angle configuration that testing had proven most effective. And it identified priority protection zones based on statistical analysis of where crew casualties most frequently occurred: waist gun positions, radio operator stations, ball, turret entry areas, and the spaces adjacent to crew member positions not already covered by factory-installed armor. Implementation across the 8th Air Force proceeded rapidly through spring 1944. Every bomb group received copies of the technical order, along with training materials showing proper installation techniques. Crew chiefs were authorized to draw salvaged armor plate from base salvage yards, materials that had previously been sitting unused or shipped back to depots for eventual scrapping. The program required no new production, no procurement contracts, no allocation of scarce manufacturing capacity. It simply repurposed materials already in the supply system. By April, an estimated 300 B-17 bombers carried salvaged armor installations. By May, that number exceeded 500. The program expanded beyond the 8th Air Force in England to include the 15th Air Force operating from Italy. B-24 Liberator groups adapted the techniques to their aircraft, though the different internal configuration required modified placement strategies. The salvaged armor program became standard practice across the Army Air Force's European bomber fleet. The statistical impact became undeniable by mid-1944. A comprehensive analysis conducted by the 8th Air Force's Operational Research Section examined casualty data from January through June 1944, comparing aircraft with and without armor installations. The study, led by civilian mathematician Dr. Leonard Rosen, documented a 41% reduction in crew fatalities from fighter attacks among aircraft equipped with salvaged armor compared to unarmored aircraft, sustaining similar levels of battle damage. The reduction wasn't uniform across all damage categories. As Morrison's testing had indicated, the armor provided no benefit against certain types of attacks. But for the most common threat, 20mm cannon fire from beam and frontal attacks, the protection was substantial. Aircraft struck by cannon fire in armored sections showed crew casualty rates of 8.3% compared to 23.7% for identical hits to unarmored sections. The armor couldn't prevent all deaths, but it prevented most deaths in the areas it protected. Rosen's analysis also documented a secondary effect that Kowalski had observed but couldn't quantify. Crews flying in armored aircraft showed lower rates of combat stress and psychiatric casualties. Men who believed they had better protection were more likely to complete their required 25 mission tours without psychological breakdown. The armor's psychological benefit complemented its physical protection, creating a synergistic effect on overall crew survivability. The program's success created an unusual situation where field mechanics became subject matter experts, consulted by engineers and planners. In April 1944, Master Sergeant Kowalski was temporarily assigned to Wright Field to advise on armor placement for the next generation of heavy bombers under development. He spent 3 weeks working with Boeing and Douglas engineers, reviewing proposed B-29 and B-32 designs, and recommending locations for integrated armor protection based on his combat damage analysis. The engineers initially approached the consultation with poorly concealed condescension, a mechanic advising graduate engineers on design decisions. That attitude changed during the first technical review when Kowalski demonstrated comprehensive understanding of blast effects, fragmentation patterns, and the specific failure modes that killed bomber crews. His knowledge came from examining hundreds of damaged aircraft and understanding what the damage meant for the men inside them. The engineers knew theory, Kowalski knew reality. By the end of his assignment, Boeing had incorporated several of his recommendations into the B-29's armor protection scheme. June 6, 1944, D-Day, marked a shift in the strategic air campaign. With Allied forces ashore in Normandy, the 8th Air Force's mission focus expanded to include tactical support of ground operations alongside continued strategic bombing of German industry. The intensity of fighter opposition began declining as the Luftwaffe was ground down by cumulative losses and fuel shortages. But the armor program's value didn't diminish with reduced fighter threat. The aircraft that had been protected through the darkest months of late 1943 and early 1944 were still flying. The armor installations that had saved lives during missions to Schweinfurt and Berlin continued protecting crews during attacks on transportation networks in France and oil refineries in Eastern Europe. And new threats emerged. German fighter pilots, increasingly desperate, began ramming attacks when ammunition was exhausted. The armor that had been designed to defeat cannon shells also provided some protection against structural impacts from collisions. By summer 1944, Master Sergeant Kowalski had been promoted to warrant officer, an unusual elevation for an enlisted maintainer that reflected the Army Air Force's recognition of his contributions. He returned to Bassingbourn in July and continued supervising armor installations while training new mechanics in the techniques that had become standard practice. The war's trajectory had shifted decisively in favor of the Allies, but Kowalski's innovation continued saving lives as bomber operations pressed deeper into Germany through the final year of the war. The salvaged armor program's legacy extended beyond its immediate tactical impact. It represented a validation of field innovation over bureaucratic procedure. Kowalski had identified a problem, developed a solution using available resources, implemented it despite regulations prohibiting unauthorized modifications, and ultimately forced the institutional military to acknowledge that mechanics in combat zones sometimes understood operational requirements better than engineers in distant offices. The program also demonstrated effective resource utilization during wartime scarcity. The armor that protected bomber crews required no additional manufacturing capacity, consumed no scarce raw materials, and diverted no production from other priorities. It simply repurposed materials the supply system had classified as waste. This efficiency made the program sustainable even as demands on industrial production intensified through 1944. Perhaps most significantly, the salvaged armor program changed how the Army Air Forces approached field modifications in general. Before Kowalski's work, unauthorized modifications were treated primarily as discipline problems, violations of regulations that threatened aircraft safety and procurement standardization. After the armor program's success, field modifications were increasingly viewed as potential innovations worthy of evaluation rather than automatic rejection. Technical orders began, including provisions for temporary field expedient modifications pending formal engineering review, creating institutional pathways for future innovations developed by maintainers and crews. The final months of the war in Europe, from January through May 1945, saw continued evolution of the armor program. As the Luftwaffe's fighter force collapsed under cumulative attrition, anti-aircraft fire became the primary threat to bomber formations. The armor installations designed to defeat cannon shells proved less effective against flak fragments, which approached from different angles and had different velocity characteristics. But crew chiefs adapted, adding supplemental plates in overhead positions to protect against fragments falling from above after flak bursts. These adaptations followed the same pattern Kowalski had established. Mechanics observed damage patterns, identified vulnerable areas, and installed protection using available materials. The formal technical orders were amended quarterly to incorporate successful field modifications, creating an iterative improvement cycle that kept pace with evolving threats. By war's end, the average B-17 inches Europe carried between 80 and 120 pounds of supplemental armor beyond the factory installation, all of it salvaged and repurposed materials installed following field-developed procedures. Victory in Europe on May 8, 1945, ended the strategic bombing campaign that had driven armor program development. But the program's influence continued in the Pacific theater. B-29 superfortresses bombing Japan faced similar threats from Japanese fighters, particularly during low-altitude night raids against urban targets. Maintenance officers in the 20th Air Force consulted Kowalski's technical reports and adapted his salvaged armor techniques to the B-29's different configuration. The principles proved transferable, and B-29 groups began installing supplemental armor using the same repurposed materials approach. Frank Kowalski remained in the Army Air Forces after the war, transitioning to the newly independent United States Air Force in 1947. He retired as a Chief Warrant Officer in 1953, his service record documenting innovations in aircraft maintenance that extended beyond the armor program to include improvements in cold weather operations, rapid battle damage repair, and maintenance training methods. He never sought publicity for his wartime work, regarding the armor program as simply doing what needed to be done with the resources available. The post-war analysis of 8th Air Force operations produced detailed statistical studies that quantified the armor program's impact. The most comprehensive assessment, published by the Air Force Historical Research Agency in 1952, estimated that salvaged armor installations prevented between 400 and 600 crew fatalities during the period from January 1944 through May 1945. The estimate was conservative, counting only cases where damaged armor showed clear evidence of having disrupted shell detonation or contained fragmentation that would otherwise have caused fatal injuries. The actual number was likely higher, as the analysis couldn't account for attacks that might have occurred but didn't, because German pilots recognized armored aircraft and chose different targets. Nor could it quantify the psychological benefits that helped crews complete their tours without psychiatric breakdown. But even the conservative estimate represented hundreds of young men who flew missions, came home, and lived full lives after the war specifically because one crew chief had refused to accept that regulations were more important than survival. The salvaged armor program influenced post-war aircraft design philosophy. When the Air Force began developing jet-powered strategic bombers in the late 1940s, protection systems were integrated into the basic design from the beginning rather than added later as afterthoughts. The B-47 and B-52 bombers featured comprehensive armor protection for crew compartments, electronic systems, and critical components, all engineered during initial development. The lessons learned from Kowalski's field modifications had been absorbed into institutional practice. Modern military aircraft continue reflecting principles established by the salvaged armor program. The concept of supplemental protection using available materials in response to emerging threats remains standard practice. Aircraft operating in combat zones routinely receive field modifications based on observed enemy tactics and weapons. The formal procedures for evaluating and authorizing these modifications trace their institutional origins directly to the technical orders, developed in 1944 to legitimize Kowalski's work. Frank Kowalski died in 1978 at age 61, having lived long enough to see jet bombers and guided missiles replace the B-17 seconds he'd worked on during the war. His obituary in the Air Force Times mentioned his innovations in aircraft armor, but provided few details. Most of the men whose lives his work had saved never knew his name. The armor plates that protected them were invisible, hidden inside fuselages, unmarked in maintenance logs, and anonymous in operation. But the evidence of Kowalski's impact remains in the archives: the technical orders bearing his name, the statistical studies showing impossible survival rates, the photographs of damaged armor plates with unexploded shells embedded in them, and most importantly, the records of bomber crews who completed their tours, returned home, raised families, and lived ordinary lives that would have been cut short without protection, that one mechanic insisted was more important than regulations. The story of the salvaged armor program contains no dramatic battlefield heroics, no last stands against impossible odds, no moments of individual valor that fit comfortable narrative templates. Instead, it's a story about institutional resistance overcome by undeniable evidence, about creativity applied to resource constraints, about the gap between how systems are designed to work and how they actually work when people are dying. Frank Kowalski saw bombers returning with damage that killed crew members who could have been saved. He recognized that materials already available could provide protection. He understood that waiting for official authorization meant more unnecessary deaths, and he made a choice that violated regulations but saved lives. The decision required moral courage, technical competence, and willingness to accept personal risk for others' benefit. Those qualities don't fit easily into citations or commendations, but they define the kind of leadership that matters most when the stakes are measured in human lives. The B-17 Flying Fortress earned its legendary reputation through a combination of robust design, effective armament, and the courage of the crews who flew them into lethal skies over Germany. But part of that legend rests on innovations that never appeared in Boeing's promotional materials or official Air Force histories. The hidden armor plates, the salvaged materials repurposed by mechanics working night shifts, the unauthorized modifications that became standard practice only after proving their value in blood and statistics. Modern visitors to Air Force museums can see restored B-17 seconds displayed as examples of American engineering and industrial might. The aircraft are beautiful, maintained to pristine condition that would have been impossible in wartime. But looking at those preserved bombers provides no hint of the field modifications that made the difference between survival and loss for hundreds of crews. The supplemental armor was removed during post-war restoration, the non-standard installations eliminated to return aircraft to factory specifications. The evidence of Kowalski's work exists only in photographs and technical documents archived in research facilities. Perhaps that's appropriate. The armor program was never about recognition or legacy. It was about solving an immediate problem using available resources when official channels were too slow and bureaucratic procedures were obstacles rather than safeguards. It was about mechanics who understood that their job wasn't maintaining aircraft to specifications, but keeping crews alive long enough to complete their missions and come home. The mathematics of the salvaged armor program are straightforward. Quarter-inch steel plate, angled at 15 degrees, weighing 15 to 20 pounds per installation, capable of disrupting the detonation sequence of 20mm cannon shells, approximately 63% of the time. 400 to 600 lives saved through implementation across 500 to 600 aircraft over 16 months of operations. A cost measured entirely in materials already written off as unsalvageable, labor performed during otherwise idle maintenance hours, and regulatory violations that were ultimately pardoned when results proved undeniable. But mathematics don't capture the full story. They don't explain the mechanics working double shifts to install protection in aircraft flying missions the next morning. They don't describe the pilots who requested specific bombers because they knew those aircraft had better survival odds. They don't quantify the difference between dying at 22 over Germany and living to 78 in suburban America. The numbers document impact, but miss the human dimensions of innovation born from necessity and implemented through determination. The lesson that endures from Frank Kowalski's salvaged armor program isn't primarily technical. It's not about the specific engineering solutions he developed or the materials he repurposed. Those details mattered enormously in 1943 and 44, but have limited relevance to modern aircraft operating in radically different threat environments. The enduring lesson is about institutional flexibility, field innovation, and the courage to deviate from established procedures when those procedures are inadequate for the situation at hand. Military organizations function through standardization, hierarchy, and procedure. These structures exist for valid reasons. They ensure consistency, maintain safety standards, and prevent chaos that would result from everyone improvising independently. But rigid adherence to procedure can become obstacle rather than safeguard when circumstances change faster than institutions can adapt. The challenge is distinguishing between necessary rules and bureaucratic inertia, between modifications that improve systems and changes that introduce unacceptable risk. Kowalski navigated that distinction through empirical testing and careful documentation. He didn't simply bolt armor to aircraft and hope for the best. He tested installations, monitored results, adapted techniques based on evidence, and maintained meticulous records that would eventually prove his methods were sound. When forced to defend his unauthorized work, he could present data showing improved outcomes. The program succeeded not despite his violation of regulations, but because he violated them methodically, documented his approach carefully, and produced results that couldn't be dismissed. That methodology, applying engineering rigor to unauthorized field modifications, established a template that remains relevant. Modern military organizations face similar tensions between procedural compliance and operational necessity. Equipment designed for predicted threats encounters actual threats that differ in critical ways. Field units identify problems and develop solutions while institutional procurement systems move at bureaucratic pace. The specific technologies change. The underlying dynamic remains constant. The salvaged armor program demonstrated that institutions can accommodate field innovation when the evidence is compelling and the advocates are persistent. Kowalski's work was ultimately incorporated into official technical orders, his methods validated through formal testing, his unauthorized modifications transformed into authorized standard practice. The path from violation to validation required risk, documentation, and eventual support from officers like Captain Hartman and General Castle, who recognized that results mattered more than regulatory compliance. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. That progression from field improvisation to institutional adoption represents the best outcome for military innovation. Ideas proven in combat are tested formally, standardized for wider application, and incorporated into training and doctrine. The cycle allows tactical learning to inform strategic planning while maintaining safety standards and quality control. But the cycle only works when institutions remain open to evidence that contradicts established practice, and when individuals are willing to take risks to develop and advocate for better approaches. Frank Kowalski's legacy lives in every modern aircraft that carries supplemental protection adapted to specific threat environments. It lives in the procedures that allow field modifications pending engineering review. It lives in the institutional memory of how one mechanic's unauthorized armor installation program saved hundreds of lives and changed how the Air Force thought about crew protection. And it lives in the principle that sometimes the people closest to problems understand solutions better than distant experts, and that regulations exist to serve purposes rather than purposes existing to serve regulations. The salvaged armor that protected B-17 crews through the darkest months of the air war over Germany represented ingenuity applied under pressure, resourcefulness born from scarcity, and courage expressed through willingness to violate rules when lives were at stake. The armor plates themselves have long since been scrapped or archived. The bombers they protected have mostly been dismantled. The men they saved have aged and died. But the example endures of what one determined individual can accomplish when armed with evidence, driven by necessity, and unwilling to accept that official procedures are more important than the lives of those who serve. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.